Thank you. Thanks for coming to see this. So today I'm mostly going to be talking in the context of state and local government policies. There's a lot of work that's been going on in that area. And I'm going to skip a couple slides because I probably missed an email that Hassam nicely sent and I didn't realize this was a panel, so it's a little long, so I'm going to skip a couple stuff. It's not necessarily, you all know what we're talking about. So we know we have a lot of options for creating low carbon concrete, getting us to various GWP limits that are being set by whomever. But there's still a lot of things that are stopping us from actually implementing that. And even when there's a policy or a legislation put in place, there's still a lot of barriers there. And so there's a number of items that I'm going to go through here. One of the first ones, of course, is fear of cost. Is there an upcharge for these materials? That's sort of the first question you get, and depending on where you are in the country, there isn't a lot of times, but there's actually a lot of hidden costs involved with moving towards lower carbon concrete systems that have to do with education and training and just trying to figure out what's going on with all of these policies and what rules you have to make. So there is, beyond just a cost associated with new particular technology, which may or may not exist depending on where you are, you really have to take into account the costs of training your staff in new technologies, new techniques, updating. If you're an agency, you're looking at updating specs, you're looking at updating your approval processes. So there's a whole slew of sort of items that go along with that cost item. Knowledge transfer is, of course, also difficult, right? I've been talking about this for 2 years. There's still plenty of discussions to be had in this area. And knowledge transfer is not just to the engineers in the room. There's a whole group of range of people that are involved with concrete, from the masons laying it up through the owners and to the policymakers, right? And all of those folks need education, and they need to be brought in as stakeholders to the conversation. And most of the time, the education that I can give to a licensed design professional is not going to be the same set of information that a building official needs, and not the same set of information that a mason needs, right? And so we can't just be putting one set of documents out. We need to tailor it to the needs of the different communities within the area. Space and capital within concrete facilities is a really big problem, and actually a really big barrier in certain parts of this country to implementing new materials and innovative materials. We look in New York City, we have some concrete plants that are, barely bigger than this room, right? They've got 2 silos. They have no space for another one, even if they wanted to put the money out to build another one. And so they really don't have a lot of options when it comes to looking at bringing in all these different types of innovative materials, right? They've probably got one now that has type 1L cement in it, and then one that has an SCM, and that's the SCM that they've got to use because that's all the space they have for it. Same thing with aggregates. When we start looking at using ternary blends and high blend systems, do they even have the space to bring in an intermediate aggregate to help increase the particle packing? It starts to become a real issue. Risk, of course, is always a concern, especially right now when we're still in this space where codes and standards are still being developed, right? 323 was just released yesterday, but that doesn't answer all of the questions. I'm sure Emily's going to talk about this a little bit more next, but we really need broader standardization and broader codes to help offset some of this risk and provide people with the safety net to move forward with these without having to take it all on themselves. And then a lot of this can really be overcome with the right political will, but talking to policymakers and legislators in different states, this is coming straight out of department policymakers. Rules are coming in New York and New Jersey. We have like direct legislation about low carbon concrete, right? All of these folks are trying to make an effort and have really good intentions, but they actually sometimes are their own barrier because they are not concrete experts. And so trying to get the right people into the room to talk to them and explain all of the technical issues associated with moving towards low carbon concrete. What are the real costs? Who needs to be involved in that conversation? That's another barrier to getting forward, and that takes time. It takes effort to really get all those people together. I want to talk a little bit about all of the policy that has happened. This is not an exhaustive map, but this just shows you kind of how widespread policy action is throughout the U.S. In particular, and there's more places that I could add stars to that I didn't. For example, Massachusetts is moving fast on stuff. I think Illinois is as well. So there's a lot of policy action that's been happening, and a lot of it is not necessarily the same from place to place, right? There's a lot of different things that are being pushed forward, and part of that is because we as a community have not come to consensus on everything yet either, and so they're trying to fill the gap and move fast. We know that low carbon construction is moving faster than anything we've ever experienced in the construction industry, and so we're sort of sometimes trying to move along at our normal pace as concrete folks, and the policymakers need us to move faster, and so they're kind of bypassing us, and so that's causing some issues. I'm going to skip ahead to just sort of a summary, but there's basically really been a very large variability in the policies that have been put up across the U.S., benchmarking differences, limit differences. How do you actually calculate what your GWP is? Are you doing upfront embodied? Should you be doing whole building analysis? Are you providing incentives for using low carbon concrete? Is it a requirement? So carrot, stick issues. Some people are doing both. Some people are doing neither. Some people it's completely voluntary. And again, not all of this is done with appropriate guidance. But most of these are requiring at some level licensed design professionals to sign off on some sort of specification that sets performance requirements. And again, they're having to do that without good guidance. And so you get back to that risk question of do they really feel comfortable being the person putting themselves on the limb to do something new? And so that's a very real barrier, and we see a lot of resistance to that for good reason. And there are some code provisions and policy provisions that have been proposed that are, quite frankly, unobtainable by our industry with current technology, regardless of whether you have access to the right materials or not. I do want to talk a little bit about what we know in terms of what has been successful. When we look at these different policies that have been put in across the U.S., what has actually been effective, what is resulting in change. We know that trying to stay towards technology agnostic policies is really important. So not really staying away from prescriptive requirements for low carbon concrete, staying away from specific technologies, right? Letting your concrete manufacturers, letting your engineers be the ones to decide what is the right tool to use has been a really strong approach. Getting very engaged with your community stakeholders, really getting everybody in that whole chain involved in having a voice at the table, and getting leadership of all of those different agencies that might be involved at the table at the beginning. So getting them involved in both the policy development level and then later on in the implementation, right? If you're with a group that's starting to talk about policy development and they're doing it in a vacuum without the experts, concrete experts at the table, there's going to be a lot more resistance on the implementation phase when that phase comes because they didn't have a voice at the table. Getting a lot of community involvement and working with the right contractors to transfer knowledge. A lot of times we see resistance to these policies because of that big question about cost, right? What is this going to cost? And so particularly when these policies have ended up on the legislative level where you've got lawmakers actually voting on whether to pass a bill or not, there's a lot of concern from their constituents over what is the actual cost of moving this forward. So that also involves community engagement and education to really talk about that with constituents, not just the stakeholders within the concrete community. having policies or agencies that are willing to absorb some level of risk is also a really key factor in this. We've seen some of the early adopters that have put low carbon requirements into their, mostly at the municipal level, into their building codes, have also said, you know, look, if we get a crack in our sidewalk because of this, we're not going to make you replace it. We understand that this is new, and they've kind of signed agreements with their contractors for that, and that's really helped sort of remove some of those comfort barriers. And then in some places we're also looking at cost offsets. So in New Jersey, they've gone with this incentive program where there's a tax incentive. If you use low carbon concrete, you'll get a tax rebate based off of the amount of concrete that was used. They're still in the final rulemaking for that, but that sort of incentive is how they were able to get the legislation through the state, is to offset some of those startup costs that I talked about. What should policies focus on? So if you're working with folks, what we know is really strong policies result in action. There's been a lot of these sort of resolutions that have been put out saying, oh, we should use low carbon concrete. And for the most part, they've been ignored unless there's been really dedicated leaders within the community to push those resolutions forward. We know that actual requirements set forth in bills to meet certain targets, those are the ones that actually result in low carbon change or moving towards more low carbon systems. The resolutions that we have seen that have been successful have only been successful with a lot of community engagement. And so if you don't have the capability of making strong policy, working with your community very closely helps to deal with that. And one of the things that I like to point out is that small communities can make a big impact, right? This does not, you don't need to be setting policy on the state level or the federal level all the time, right? The smaller the community you are trying to set policy with, a lot of times the easier it is to engage the community enough to move forward. And so if you're seeing a lot of, if you're in a state perhaps where there's a lot of resistance to low carbon policy, working with your local municipalities is often a good way to get started. This is how New York started. There were a number of small communities that took on an effort of using low carbon concrete. They showed that it was possible, that the costs were reasonable, and then with that information, the state legislature was able to show, look, we've proven this in these small communities, let's bring it statewide. How can we require some of the best practices out there? Again, the risk and cost offsets, good funding and technology transfer. A number of those small communities in New York, not only did they stand by their resolutions, but they actually put their money where their mouth was in terms of spreading information. They were sending their mayor out all across the state to talk about how they did this, how they brought the community together, what the costs were, really being open about that. Mandatory language, so again, Emily's going to talk about codes and standards, but moving towards mandatory language is really important. Stakeholder buy-in and that technology agnostic part of it. And when we talk about stakeholders, I talked about this earlier, but really looking at the entire range of stakeholders from, you know, your internal stakeholders as a municipality or a state, to your external stakeholders, to all of the companies that are outside of that ring, kind of going along that whole round. The last thing I want to finish with is sort of what some of our barriers to communication are, right? We can't just put out the same information that I'm talking to you about. You know, you have a basic understanding in this room. I have been in rooms where when a municipality says, I really want to go towards green concrete and have a green concrete policy, people have said, why do we want to make all of our concrete green? Right? Literally the color green, right? So there are basic communication issues that we need to be aware of that we use every day that are not common in the public. Options, having a good understanding of what your options are, particularly locally, is really important. So developing language that is based off of what you have available is really important. So really moving away from just saying, oh, well, there's slag and there's fly ash and there's ground glass pozzolan. What is actually being used in your region and what is available? Even if your plant doesn't necessarily have that, is it easy to get it into your community? Cost perceptions, right? So in terms of actual materials, a lot of times we can make changes with little or no cost. It's really about the educational side of things, and so working with local producers is really going to make a lot of changes. The great thing that we know is that a lot of the technologies are actively in use. We've been using a lot of these technologies for lots of reasons already. It's just not necessarily been used at high enough levels to meet some of our global warming potential requirements, but they know these a lot of these materials they already know, so there's not a lot of barrier there. And then the last thing is just sort of combating misinformation, right? You know, there's a lot of media out there talking about how concrete is destroying the world, right? And, you know, yes, as a whole, concrete produces a lot of CO2, though that 7% number that we talk about is a little bit misleading for the US, right? That's a global number. It's not really where we are here in the US. But a lot of times we have to talk about concrete contextually, how much of it we're actually making, what the impact is per unit volume, right? It's, yes, we produce a lot of CO2, but we also produce a lot of concrete, right? We can make something like over 400 Hoover dams every year with the amount of concrete that we cast each year. So we really need to think about that. So again, in summary, policy is important, but it's only a part of the picture. We are working on having the policies that are out there converge with methodologies and what the best practices are. But really, to get all of that together, we need to get all of our stakeholders talking to each other and working together. So I'll stop there and thank you, and I will take questions from the panel later.